What's up, everybody? Time for another episode of Mythic Conversations. If you're catching this on the replay, either here on the Mythic Legions Cabal, or if you're checking it out on YouTube, welcome to another night. This is episode 11. I shoot these live every Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, live on the Mythic Legions Cabal. So the start of the show usually starts a little quiet as I, do the introduction and wait for some people to join me for the live audience. And it looks like some people are just starting to join now. Mike, Chris, thank you both very much for joining. First two in tonight. Got a pretty fun show tonight, I think. It's a topic that I've been teasing the last few weeks that I think is going to open up some people's eyes to some cool possibilities. Drew, nice to see you. Mike, thank you. Yep, episode 11. Made it over that milestone, episode 10 last week. So very excited to be here tonight. Amy, thank you for joining me as every week. As usual, I'll get started probably in about a minute or so as let some people start jumping on. I know a lot of people actually do look forward to it and they plan for it, but there's always a little bit of a delay as people jump on. So let me give them a few minutes to join, and then we will get started with tonight's topic. Let's see. Chun, hello, nice to have you here. Chun, I loved your custom that you posted today, and thank you very much for the shout out for saying that my customs in this show helped inspire. Wonderful creation. I mean, what a way to start off your first custom. That was really, really great looking work. So keep it up. Very cool. John, nice to see you. Jake, yes, says, hope myself and my family are well. We are doing well. Like many people, we're now kind of about a month into this. It's crazy that it was just over a month ago that I visited Four Horsemen Studios in New Jersey to hang out with those guys and to talk to them and to to meet with the guys, the guy from Action Figure Adventure and do that interview. I can't believe it's only been a month. It seems like it's been so much longer, but we're doing well. We're all healthy, getting a little stir crazy over here. Like a lot of people, feel like putting on a few pounds with all the junk that everyone's kind of eating. Definitely could use a haircut, but I mean, if those are my biggest complaints, then I'm doing pretty well, right? Okay, so Greg is saying first time live. Thank you for joining. Let's get this show started like every week. Welcome to Mythic Conversations. If you are joining for the first time or catching this on replay and you don't know who I am, my name is Jeremy Gerard. I'm a Mythic Legions collector and customizer. I also have the distinct privilege of being the digital marketing manager for Four Horsemen Studios. You can see all of the work I do for them on their website at sourcehorseman.com. If you want to see more of my custom work, the information's right down there. You can check out my website, mythiccustoms.com. All of my custom work, including all the things we're going to see tonight, are listed on my website. I show lots of photos, including full recipes for pretty much every custom I do. So if you see anything that you like, if it inspires you and you want to create something similar, all of the information on the parts you will need to do that is on my website. You can also follow me on Instagram at Mythic Customs, all one word. I post there every single morning, normally post lots of new stuff. And of course, every Wednesday night, I'm here on Mythic Conversations live on the Facebook, the Mythic Legions Cabal on Facebook. I also repost these videos on YouTube so you can catch them there as well, especially if you want to catch one of the older episodes. Tonight is episode 11, so Facebook only holds the episodes for a period of time. If you want to check out an older episode, you can do that on YouTube. Just search for Mythic Customs and you will find me. Also consider following me there so you're notified when I put up new content. Tonight's topic is one that I've been talking about for the last few weeks. I've been teasing, and it's about removing parts of Mythic Legions figures that aren't meant to be removed. So it's something where I found myself week in and week out talking about that topic and saying, oh, I'm going to do that in a future episode. I'm going to do that in a future episode. So finally I said, you know what? No time like the present. Let's do this tonight. Let's talk about this. I think that there's definitely going to be some cool stuff that maybe you didn't know, some pieces that you can get off of Mythic Legions, and some cool ideas of what you can do with those parts once you pop them apart. Like every week, this is live, so it is a conversation. It's why I called it Mythic Conversations. This is not just me talking at you. This is me talking with you. So there is a chat feature on Facebook Live. If you have a question for me, if you want to comment on something, post it up in the chat. Throughout the presentation, I routinely will go back and look at those questions to see what's going on and see what questions I can answer, which is what I'm doing right now. Dean, very nice to see you here, man. Dean over there in the UK, nice to have you join us. Nice to have you here. Oh, and I'm not sure how to say your name. Yeser? That's a tougher one for me. But thank you very much. It's your first time joining us live. Thank you very much for joining. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. I'm happy to have you here. Anthony Husil and family. Hey, buddy. Nice to have you here. Nice to have the whole Husil family every single week. They join us. Makes me very, very happy to be part of their Wednesday night traditions now. Tim, nice to have you here as well. Let's see what else is going on. I just started doing, Amy said, I just started doing this kind of thing this weekend, should have waited. Yeah, pulling apart pieces that are meant to be apart. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. As usual, we've been saying this the last few weeks, things are kind of slow right now. Not a ton of new information happening. Four Horsemen did post a really cool teaser on their Instagram today, so if you haven't seen it, check out their Instagram. It's Four Horsemen Studios, and they put a little underscore between all of the names, all of the Four Horsemen Studios. They posted a really cool thing. It's interesting because the teasers they've been posting, I've actually seen those pieces. They were at the studio, so I know what they are. The one they showed today, I have no idea what it is. I didn't see it. It looks to me like it could maybe be a shield. If not a shield, I thought maybe like a belt emblem. If you have any of the figures that come with like the strappy belt, loin piece, the folds armor, the strappy one, it came with, actually I have one right here. So this armor right here, this waist armor, that little belt buckle in the middle, that's actually ironically removable, although it's not meant to be. It's glued in place, but it's a separate molded piece. So it made me wonder when I saw that demon looking, it's a round piece. I wonder if that's a belt buckle piece to go there. Who knows? I actually don't know what it is, but very, very cool. So if you haven't seen it, check that thing out. It looked awesome. Rob, David, thank you very much for joining. John, first time joining live because you're sheltered in place on the West Coast. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that where you are has gotten to that point. However, I'm very happy to have you live and that, hopefully we can be a little bit of a distraction for you for the next 90 minutes or so. Other than that, before I get into the topic, I know a few things that people have been asking me. Because I am a fan outside of Mythic Legions, I collect a lot of different toys. I am a G.I. Joe fan, grew up on G.I. Joe. I grew up in the 80s, so I grew up with, like G.I. Joe, Transformers, Masters of the Universe, and of course, Star Wars. So those are all big, big pieces. So I'm still a G.I. Joe fan. I don't have a lot of Joe figures because I'm strictly a 6-inch collector. So I did some of my own custom 6-inch Joes a while back, obviously with Hasbro announcing the G.I. Joe Classified series. A lot of people, when they first showed the Snake Eyes, for instance, tons of people were sending me pictures of that, which was super cool. I was very appreciative that other collectors thought of me when they saw that. I did pre-order Snake Eyes. A bunch of people kept emailing me or messaging me asking me if I got it yet. I actually had it shipped to my office, which I'm not working at my office right now. But I did go pick it up last week on Thursday after the show. I haven't opened the actual figure because the Snake Eyes itself, the package is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous packaging. But when you open up that package, like an actual G.I. Joe Classified box, so it's almost like they took a production figure like is going to be a regular release and they put it in this larger display. So I'm assuming they're going to re-release Snake Eyes. There's going to be another version. So rather than open this one, I've kind of left it in that overall display. I don't know if I'm going to sell it down the road. It's such a nice package, but you never know. Occasionally, whenever I need some funds to pay off something else that I'm buying, some of the collection gets put up. So that one could get on the auction list down the road. But yeah, for everyone that asked me if I've gotten it yet, if I've checked it out, yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely loved it. A bunch of people asked me if I had checked out the Destro they finally showed like a week or so ago. I did. I actually didn't order the Destro because my custom Destro I like better. So, I mean, the Destro they put out is super classic. It's, got the open shirt with the big emblem, but just really didn't appeal to me that much, specifically because I like mine. So I didn't buy that. Other news, I'm a huge Spawn collector. I mean, Spawn was probably what got me to be a toy collector back when I first started. And I've told this story before. I think I told this story on the podcast. But the first figures that I remember, like, hunting down were when I got my first tattoo at the age of, actually I was 17, but don't tell anybody. But when I got my first tattoo, I remember seeing at the shop they had some figures from Kenner Aliens. And this was like the Kenner Aliens Series 1 set. It had the bull alien, the gorilla alien, the scorpion alien, and the queen. And they were like nothing I had ever seen. They were so detailed, they were so cool, and they were from an R-rated movie property, which, again, is not unusual today, but back then, for me, it was. I thought they just looked really, really cool. I hunted them down, and that's what kind of got me back into toy stores. But after I got those, what really made me into a toy collector was the Spawn series from McFarlane Toys. And obviously, that's what introduced me to the Four Horsemen, into their work. So I don't have a lot of Spawn figures left, but it still holds a pretty dear place in my heart. And I've certainly used a number of Spawn figures pieces in my customs over recent past. They just did a Kickstarter today for kind of a reissue, a new version of the classic Spawn figure. They wanted like $100,000. It funded super quick. When I checked before the show, it was up to like $350,000 already. So pretty cool. If you're into Spawn, if that's part of your collecting backlog, you remember all those old Todd Toys and McFarlane Toys figures, check that out. It looked pretty cool to me. It looked super articulated, which kind of was always the knock on McFarlane, was that they were, barely articulated statues. It's one of the reasons why the Horsemen have said they wanted to move on, because they didn't want to make statues. They wanted to make action figures. So, but it looks like what he's doing now is pretty cool. I do also have the Spawn from Mortal Kombat on pre-order. So that was pretty cheap. That was like $20. The Kickstarter, I think, is like 40. So we'll see. But that's really the only toy news that I've seen. I know they're not super related to Mythic Legions, but heck, with not a ton going on, I figure it's worth talking about that stuff, right? Awesome. So, again, if you have any questions, shoot them here. Joe, nice to have you join us tonight. Tonight's topic, what I want to talk about is, as I've said a few times, removing parts of Mythic Legions figures that are not technically meant to be removed. So what do I mean by that? Early on in this show, I did kind of a little tutorial about popping Mythic Legions figures apart. I talked about heating them up in hot water, or you can use hot air. There's also an article on the Four Horsemen website that I wrote specifically about this. And for that article, I took a 1.0 figure, it was actually a Templar Legion builder, and I took a 2.0 figure, a Goblin Legion builder, and I popped them all apart. And I actually laid all the pieces out, and I displayed them. I took photos of them, so you could see exactly how those pieces come apart. I talk about the methods that I used. Normally, I personally like the hot water method. I take a mug that I use only for this. You don't want to use something that you're going to actually drink out of down the road. I mean, these are plastic parts. You don't want to be mixing that. So I have a mug specifically that I use for this. I boil some water. I put it in the microwave for like 2.5 minutes, get it nice and hot. Whatever parts I want to pop apart, I drop them in that hot water. You let them sit for 30 to 60 seconds, and then when you pull it out, you got to be careful. I always tell people, because these are figures, they have joints and they have crevices. Hot water can seep into that. When you pull it out, be careful that the water doesn't leak out and burn you. But be careful, you can pop them right apart. If there's ever a part, you can pull a lot of these pieces apart without needing any heat. But if you're ever getting any resistance, don't force it, okay? If you force trying to pull these things apart, that is how you break them. So instead of forcing it, give it a little bit of heat, pop it right apart. You can also use the hot air method. Just get a blow dryer, blow dry the area in question for, again, 30 seconds or so. Get it nice and soft. You can pop it apart. I mix and match which method I use. I will say this, that if I'm dealing with custom painted parts, I tend to go with the hot air method, only because I feel it gives me a little more control. And I get worried, even if I seal a part, I get worried about taking a custom painted piece and dropping it into a mug of flaming hot water. I'm afraid that's going to affect the paint. So if I may use hot water to break something apart, but once I paint it, when I'm trying to put it back together, I tend to use a little bit of heat. And when you are heating these parts, remember, the piece that you want to be soft and malleable is the port. So like, for instance, if you're doing like the lower arm, right? The upper arm piece where the lower arm pegs in, you're going to have a peg on the lower arm. You want to heat the hole in the upper arm. You want that to be nice and soft and malleable, so you can just pop that peg right in with no resistance. Once it's in, if you want to harden it, you want it to get nice and hard very, very quickly, you can either use cold water, or if you don't want to run it underwater, I put it in the freezer for 15 seconds, pull it right back out. It's not going to be malleable. It's going to be nice and strong at that point. That's going to allow you to break these figures down in an incredible fashion. Some pieces obviously are super easy, like the heads. Figures come with multiple heads. Those heads are made to be easily just popped off. But there's other pieces that you can remove very easily as well. You can remove, at the arms here very easily. You can remove at the waist, obviously, very easily. There's even figures like the skeleton soldier that comes with the two torsos, the female torso and the male torso. Well, obviously, you've got to pop the waist apart, pop the arms off, and pop the head off to swap out those torsos. So all that stuff's pretty easy to do, and just by swapping those parts between figures, you can do some cool creations. But one of the things that you'll start to realize if you look at these figures is there's a lot of pieces that aren't meant to be modular that are actually comprised of multiple different sculpted parts that have been glued together. Because they're glued together, once again, with a little bit of heat and some patience and being careful, you can pull those apart. And there are some really cool things that you can do with this. So let me give you an example. And this is the only example I actually have from the 1.0, like the early style figures. That first series seemingly didn't have a lot of parts that were constructed of separate pieces the way that Advent of Decay and Beyond does. But one piece that you can use is the orc heads that come with the helmets. So like we first saw that with Urku. The Urku head that has the helmet, and then we saw it with Gorthok, the Shadow Orc. He came with two heads, an unhelmeted and a helmeted. And then we've also seen that helmeted head like with Kaurus. So if you don't have an Urku or a Gorthok, because those are harder to find figures, maybe you have a Kaurus. And if you have a Kaurus and you've got the cat head on it, you have that extra green orc head lying around that you may not know what to do with. Here's a cool idea. You can pop that helmet right off, and you can do something cool like add it to a goblin. And that's all it is. All I did, now if you pop this off the orc, by the way, don't think that you're going to underneath that helmet have an orc that's got a cool unhelmeted head. The pieces under the parts that we're going to pop apart, they're not going to be really usable as is. I've got some ideas of some things you can do with them, but as is, they're not going to be very attractive because the way the tops of those heads are created, they're meant to peg in and glue in to the tops of the helmet. So they're flat and they have ridges in them. It's not like it's a bald, rounded orc head that just pops on. But once you pull that off, and again, just a little bit of heat, what you're going to find is there's just inside of that helmet, there's just a little bit of glue. If you heat that and you're patient and you start to separate it, you can pretty easily pop that off. Now, some parts are going to be easier to do than others. There are some figures that just are easier to do, and there's also going to be some figures that when they glued them at the factory, maybe they used a little less glue. That's going to be an easier one to separate than one where maybe they overdid it on the glue a little bit, right? But that's one of the things I did here, where I did this custom this custom goblin, and this is just a Goblin Legion builder head. I cut one of his ears off to give him a little bit of like a really kind of gritty look here. I added some different body parts, did some paint on him, but you pop that helmet on, and it just really goes right on there. And that's a cool look. This is one of the first Goblin customs that I did when I was just kind of looking for different options, looking for different cool Goblin variations that I could make. And like I said, that particular one was an extra Gorthok head that I had lying around. You may say, I don't even have a Gorthok, much less an extra one lying around. That's cool. Absolutely, go ahead, if you have that extra Kauros, pull off that head, and it's going to be like that reddish metal. Spray paint that black, do a little bit of dry brushing on it, grab yourself a Goblin Legion builder, do a little dry brushing on that as well. The two pieces will work together wonderfully. Super, super easy custom you can do to add a cool little helmet to one of your Goblin figures using a part that might actually be in your fodder bin right now. Dustin, thanks for joining. Danielle, thanks for joining. JD, got to go. Dean, thanks for joining. Hopefully you can catch it in replay. So that's just one idea that you can do there. Staying on the whole Goblin kind of kick for a minute, one of the Goblins that I absolutely loved early on was King Noglin. So King Noglin, just that expression that he has this kind of like smirk, so much personality in that expression. But it's a head that you can really only use as King Noglin because he's got that big crown, right? No, not necessarily. I saw that crown and I started looking at it and I said, that's a separate piece. That's gotta come off. So once again, with a little bit of heat and some pressure, I pulled it off. And when you do pull it off, here is one of them. It kind of comes apart in two separate pieces. Okay, so it's on his head like this. Let me get a little closer here. So it's on his head like this, and if you look at it, there's like seams on the sides. So it actually pulls apart in two pieces. This back piece here that has the holes, his ears go through that holes. I was able to remove both of those pieces, and what I was left with was a King Noglin head, and he actually had indentations in the head. Once again, it wasn't totally usable because on the inside of the crown, there were little plastic tabs that go into some slots on the head, and that's where it was glued in. They're very, very small, which made them somewhat easy to remove, but the head itself didn't look really good. So this is one that was a little bit more complex, which what I did here was I used something called epoxy sculpt. So epoxy sculpt, and it's APOXIE, epoxy sculpt. I used that, and what it is it's a two-part compound. It's a two-part compound. It comes in these two separate, containers, and you have to mix them in equal proportions. So you take a little ball from one, a little ball from the other, mix them together, let it kind of mix for about 30 minutes, and then you can start to work with it. I've talked about this in previous episodes. I'm not like a great sculptor or anything, but doing something like this was really, really simple. I think last week I showed how I used epoxy sculpt to sculpt a little additional bone on the back of that helmet that I used for my Frost Goblin Wolf Rider. What I did on this one was I just filled in those gaps. I filled in those gaps that were left by removing the crown. I let it dry. I sanded them down just a little bit, and then I just gave the whole thing a little bit of a paint job to match so I could create, this is a character I called Boom Boom. He's my Goblin explosives expert. And his sticks of dynamite are actually from a Muppets figure of Crazy Harry. He's also got like a big round bomb, like one of those generic kind of big round bombs with a wick coming out. Again, my interpretation of the goblins is very much Jim Henson oriented. I imagine them being very, very mischievous, kind of silly. So I like them to be a little comical. You wouldn't imagine Mythic Legions figures having a couple sticks of dynamite in their bandolier, but for me, I think that's fun. That kind of works. But even if you didn't do something, make them a silly bomber type character, I just think that head looks so, so cool by removing that crown. The look you're going to get by removing something like that, very, very simple. Very, very cool. Again, not as easy as what I showed removing the orc helmet, because that was just remove the helmet, pop it on this head, and you're good to go. This one's going to require a bit more work, but I think it's definitely worth it. And if you're looking to build out your goblin ranks and you want some new looks, I think that will help a lot. Travis, nice to have you here. Walter, nice to have you here as well, buddy. So what's next? Let's stick with goblins. Let's continue. Let's finish off the goblins before we move on to something else. So another goblin that's got pieces that you can remove. And again, start looking at your Mythic Legions. Start looking at the component pieces of how they're built. You're going to start to find that there's a lot of pieces that are just separate parts that aren't part of the full sculpt that can be removed. For instance, last week I was talking about on the goblins, on the backs of their elbows, those pieces of armor that you have right here on the elbows, I showed the Wolf Rider where I had pulled those off and I glued them to the top of the shoulders to make these little shoulder pads there. And someone had commented, I didn't know those were removable. I accidentally removed one. That's how I figured it out. But when you start looking at these figures, you're going to start to see on a lot of them that there are these separate pieces that you can remove. And pretty much any of the 2.0 figures that have any kind of shoulder armor, elbow armor, those can be actually removed. Now, again, let me just put a caveat here. None of this stuff was meant to be removed. I said that at the start. We're going to talk about pieces that you can remove that weren't meant to be removed. So I say that because if you try to remove these things, there is a chance you could break it. You do have to be careful, okay? Because they're glued in place, if you start to pull on the plastic to remove it and you put too much force, you could tear it. You could absolutely rip the plastic. Now, in some cases, like if I'm removing this crown, if I tore this crown, I didn't, but if I tore this crown, say I tore one of the ear holes in there, I don't care. I'm really not going to use this piece. So it's not something that I'm going to be all that worked up about. But there are some other parts I'm going to show in a little bit that if I ripped it while removing it, it would kind of defeat the whole point of what I was trying to accomplish. So if you are doing these things, be very, very careful. Take your time. Be aware of what you're removing and, really work with the plastic to make sure that you're separating it slowly and not just trying to rip it apart. As I was saying with the goblins, as you start looking at those pieces, you're going to see, oh, this is a separate piece. For instance, Snag. Snag the Goblin Thief's got that great expressive face and he's got that cool little blue cap on, right? That blue cap is totally a separate piece. Think about it. When they produced that at the factory, that was molded as a separate piece. It was painted as a separate piece. It was probably way easier to paint without it being attached to the actual figure. That's one of the way these figures have such incredibly crisp paint jobs, because some of these pieces are painted and then assembled after the fact. Well, we can disassemble them and use them in our customs. So last week I showed this guy who's one of my favorites, right? I showed Gunzo here, my goblin. He lost his little loin piece. I showed my goblin Tinker with his wings. And I showed this as an example last week of putting together a bunch of different techniques. But this head here, this used that snag head. So when I removed that cap from Snag, I trimmed down the top of his head, and the helmet I put on him, I mentioned this last week, that came from a Muppets Palisades Gonzo figure. But this is an example of what I was able to do with that super cool expressive Snag face once I had that hat off of him. Another example that I've shown previously is this witch. So this witch figure, when I looked at around Halloween, I was creating a whole bunch of figures based on the Ray Bradbury story, The Halloween Tree, and I needed a witch. And I was trying to figure out, I wanted like a super classic long, nose, long green nose witch, warts, the whole 9 yards, pointy hat. And I was looking to figure out what pieces I was going to use to make that recipe. And I looked at the Snag face and I said, that actually has a lot of the traits of a witch. So what I did was, I not only removed the cap, I actually did slice out the teeth on that as well. And it's a little tough to see because of the way her hat shadows her face. But let's see if it will focus there. But that ended up becoming a really good looking witch for me. And once again, there we go. That uses just a Snag head. It does have a bit of a repaint on it, but it's a Snag head that has that cap removed. And then I sliced out that teeth to create that witch. And that's the thing that you got to think about when you start doing this. When you remove parts, in some cases, you end up with 2 pieces that you can now use. So I just showed 2 different customs that used a Snag head minus the hood. Well, now you got a hood. What are you going to do with that? I've actually seen some people use that hood with a Goblin Legion builder head. They pop it on one of these style heads, and that creates another new look, especially because Snag has that long, pronounced nose, and the Goblin Legion builder head has such a small, squat nose. That kind of contrast between the 2 heads and how they look, even if they're both wearing the same hat, that's really, really cool. And one of the things that you can do too, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, if you want to do some repainting on these parts, like I said, at the factory, they paint them so nicely because they're separated. When you separate them, you can paint them as well. It'll be a lot easier to paint them once they are separated. So for instance, Snag has that blue cap. Say that you want to paint that cap red. Red cap goblins are like a classic fantasy trope. Say that you want to create a whole group of red cap goblins and you want them to have different facial features. You don't only want a Snag, you also want a, like I said, a Goblin Legion builder run or a Nubnik one. You can totally do that. In fact, you could even put it back on Snag. If you say, hey, I really like Snag, but I really like him to be a red cap goblin, pull that cap off, paint it red, put it right back on Snag, and you can change the figure just doing that. I actually did paint it red, and I put it on this figure here. So I wanted to make a gnome. I wanted to make a gnome Tinker. And this is an interesting custom that doesn't use a ton of Mythic Legions parts, really just that cap. This is actually, the body on this is a Lord of the Rings figure. It's one of the hobbits, either Frodo or Sam in goblin disguise. But I put like a little jacket, another hobbit jacket on him, a whole bunch of different parts. That super big wrench is actually from that series called Zevos that I mentioned last week, the same series that supplied the big wings that my Gunzo winged goblin has. But that wrench comes from that as well. I thought it looked good to create a fun look on this gnome here. And that head is actually from a Hobbit Radicast, Radicast the Brown I had like a 6-inch scale figure of him, not a great figure, but kind of a cool head. And there's a lot of other parts here too. These goggles are from like a Marvel Select figure. The goggles in front of his face are from a Star Wars figure. There's a lot of parts that went into this, but one of the main pieces is that cap that he's wearing that came right from a snag. I really dig this little guy. I've said multiple times that I like adding new races, new kinds of characters to my collection. I obviously didn't have a gnome. They haven't done anything like gnomes, so that was a fun little character to kind of figure out what recipe I would use to make that. And he looks great next to. He's like a good size next to the guy, a little bit smaller than the goblins, and then you've got all the different scales of Mythic Legions. He fits in really, really nicely. Let's see if we got any questions here. Have a drink. So Patrick Boyle saying hello. David saying pop and paint is a must. Yeah, absolutely. This figure here. So this is my Zartan figure that I've shown a few times. This obviously uses a head from like a Shadow Elf Ranger or an Elf Ranger. I forget which one this one started as. But trying to paint that head, I painted all of the skin this like ashen gray color because this is a changeling, which was appropriate for Zartan. So to paint that head, that ashen gray color, and to paint that face paint on, and then to paint that hood, that maroon color, if I would have tried to do that while the head was in the hood, it would have been a sloppy paint job, because either the maroon paint from the hood, I would have slipped and got some on the sides of the face, or as I was painting the face, I would have got the hood. I wouldn't have been able to get the face paint for the actual around the eyes as crisp if it was in the hood. So as David said, removing those parts is incredibly important. It's going to allow you to do much cleaner, much nicer paint jobs all around. And I'm going to talk more about the elf heads in a moment. GD, thanks for joining. Drew, thank you for the comment on the gnome. Yeah, Dustin, I want them to make a gnome race or scale figure. Yeah, I had mentioned previously that I've personally talked to them about doing smaller scale figures, and they definitely want to. It's on, I don't know when they'll ever get to it, but it's definitely in the long-term plans to do smaller races. Cornboy had mentioned, maybe they'll do them as 2-packs or something to maximize, so you get kind of the value for your buck. They couldn't do a gnome and sell it for $35 because people would lose their mind. I've heard people complain about the dwarves, saying that they can't imagine buying a dwarf because it's less figure for the same price, which I've literally never understood. It's not less figure, it's a little bit shorter scale. But I never ever understood that mentality, especially when you look at some of the dwarves, like Bromden Ironjaw, the amount of accessories that Bromden comes with. To me, that's actually one of the most bang for your buck figures in the entire line, whether it's a slightly shorter stature or not. But I digress. My point was that if they did gnomes and left them at the same price point, I know people would lose their minds. James, thanks for joining. So I was talking about the elves. I was showing Zartan. And that's actually one of the slightly more difficult pieces to pop apart, but so much potential when you do that. And actually, I'm one of the reasons I wanted to show this tonight, popping these pieces apart, was specifically because of something that I have coming up next week, where this is going to become important. I'll talk more about that towards the end of the show, but for now, let's talk about these elf heads. So when you buy any of the heads that come with hoods, so not only the Elf Ranger and the Shadow Elf Ranger, but all of the females that come with hooded heads as well, whether it's Faustia or Ravina, as a Spirit Bender, all of them, it's all the same hood. There's only one hood sculpture in the Mythic Legions line. So every one of them are compatible. To remove the heads, these are one of the removals that I have found to be a bit more difficult than others. Once again, I will boil some water, I will pop the head in, and then you start to work it out. Once you do it once, it's going to be easier to do them in the future, because once you do the first one, you're going to see where the contact points are and how it actually goes in. And I think you can use that knowledge for the next time when you're trying to pull them apart. But this is what the two pieces look like when you do separate them. Okay, so you've got this hood here, which is now empty, and then you've got this kind of insert piece that goes in. Okay, this pegs in to the back of the hood. What's tough about this particular piece is where the glue happens, kind of in the back, you don't have access to it. Like as you're trying to wedge your hands in there, you can't directly pull it apart. So it does get a little hard. A couple things I've learned, obviously, if you're having some trouble, just keep heating it more and more. Don't try to invert the hood. So if you try to like actually, and once you heat this, it is very malleable. Don't try to like invert the hood out so you can expose the head and then rip it out. What I have noticed is if you do that, sometimes you end up creasing the plastic of the hood and breaking kind of the paint. Not a huge deal if you're going to paint the hood. Like say you want to have a black hood, you just paint over that crease, so it'll probably be fine. But if you want to maintain that hood, that is going to end up being a problem for you because you're going to have that big unsightly crease. And these are white plastic. Like even when you pull it out, you can see there is some white plastic in there. If you crease it, you're going to have, like, for instance, in this case, a purple hood with a big white crease down it. So it will look very, very obvious. The way that I pull these apart is I do heat them up, and then I start to try to work it. I put my finger underneath the chin, and I start to try to pull it forward. I try to separate a little bit of the back there. I know some people will take like a little tiny flathead screwdriver and wedge that up there to try to wedge that out. I've done that as well. It is pretty effective. That has helped me. Also around the top of the head, you want to separate that. The problem is the top of the head, if you use the back, so if you put the little screwdriver in the back part here and underneath, that's going to be covered. When you put that on a figure, you don't see that. So if you get a little scrape or something there, no one's going to know. If you start to try to use that on the front part there around the forehead, you're going to scrape up both the head and the hood, and it's going to be noticeable because it's a part that's very, very visible. So I would be cautious when you do that. If you've got extra hooded heads and you want to try this, it's definitely worthwhile. You can do some cool things. Number one, you can just swap the head inserts between different hoods. So obviously, probably the most common use of that is people who want to make a Dritz custom. And I'm actually going to do a show in a few weeks that's going to be making a Dritz custom. If you're familiar with the popular Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons character, the Drow elf with a heart of gold, Dritz Doradin. It's a figure that I've done a few times. I've had a few people request me to show a cool recipe, and I have kind of a fun show to do around doing one of those customs. But Dritz is a Drow elf or a dark elf. The closest we have in Mythic Legions to Drow are the Shadow Elves. So you could take that Shadow Elf Ranger head, pop it out. Dritz famously has a green hood and cape, and you can pop that into the green hood and cape from an Elf Ranger. That's the start of a Dritz custom. Very easy way to start. You can swap that. But also if you wanted some of your hooded figures to have, certain heads in different color hoods, you can absolutely do that just by popping these apart. Another cool thing you can do is once you have this head insert out, these heads, obviously you can't use them as is. They look ridiculous. They don't even have any ears. But one thing that a lot of customizers have been doing, I know my friend Dennis Derby's been doing this quite a bit, is using hair pieces from, like, say, Marvel Legends with some of these head inserts to create unhooded versions of characters. So, for instance, This head is from Ravina, right? I removed her hood because I needed it for a project. So I had her head without the hood, and I said, well, what am I going to do with that? And then I had this here piece, which this here piece came from a a Marvel Legends Jessica Jones figure. I bought a lot of fodder, and it had a Jessica Jones, like the Netflix version of Kristen Ritter. It had that head in there. I actually have that figure in my collection, but this was just the head. So I popped the hair off, and the hair on a lot of those Mythic Legions figures, it's a separate piece, comes off super, super easy. A lot of times I can pull the Marvel Legends hair off without even using any heat. It just comes right off. But with that, you can put that onto one of those Mythic Legions head inserts if you want to create a version of a character that has a hood without a hood. Now, sometimes what you're going to have to do is you are going to have to cut the head a little bit. So for instance, that's what I had to do to her head. So if you compare that to this one here, you can see that it's not, I had to trim off some of the back of her head. It actually comes right to, you can see, I had to trim that quite a bit because it came back too far and it pushed the hair back much too. It looked unnatural. But super easy. Once you trim it down, there she is looking freaky with just some weird square head. But this hair piece, very, very simple to just pop that on, position it so it looks natural with the hairline. And I didn't glue this specifically for this demonstration, but that's a great way that you can add some hair to these figures and get some additional looks out of these characters. And once again, you're now separating that hood. You can use that hood for a variety of things, and then you can use those head inserts to create new characters and new customs as well. So we got for comments here. Drew, was the face head easy to put back in the hood? Yeah, once you get the head out of the hood, it literally goes right back in with no problem at all. Because there's almost like the top of the hood has a little kind of like a tab on it. And then this has got this little groove on the top, if you can see that little groove. So literally, and you probably can't see inside of that hood. There you go. So right there, you can see, right inside there, there's a little tab. And that tab just goes right in that groove. Position it the way you want. And this particular head actually has a little scrape on it. I got it that way. So that little scrape was just, something was broken in the head. But that's how easy it was to put that back in. And, if I just pop it right back out, boom, it's out. It's in. Okay? And look, I'm shaking it. This is such what a weird thing I'm doing right now. My point is that it's not going to fall out. I can shake it. It's not going to come popping out. So there's no glue in there now, obviously, but it's tight enough that I can very easily get it out of the hood, but I can also put it right back in. That little interaction right there of me standing close to the camera, shaking that is definitely, episode 11, that is the weirdest thing that's happened on Mythic Conversations yet, I think. That is fun. Okay. A lot of people talking about Dritz, telling me that they like him, that he appeared in the Baldur's Gate games. Jay, thanks for making it. So those are a couple things. Very, very easy to do. Like I said, removing hoods. I've got something special to talk about next week with that, so keep that in mind. Another thing that's really easy to pull apart is the crown pieces that come on a lot of the figures. So, for instance, this is a Lord Adon, right? And he had a crown piece that goes right on the front of his head. It's just pegged in, comes out super, super simple. What you actually have to be careful with this is the peg is so small that if you try to pull, you will rip it. So the peg will remain in his head, but the plastic of the attachment piece will just come off. So you want to avoid that. Give it a little bit of heat, kind of work it out so it actually comes out and you have the hole there. And so some of the things you can do. So this is a crown piece that originally came with Artemis silver cord. This was the first of these samurai inspired figures that I ever did. This was my version when I was doing my Disney princess inspired characters. This was my version of Mulan. And it was funny because I actually owe the idea of using this head to Dennis Derby. Dennis, I was talking to him at the time. It's kind of cool because I say this all the time that this Mythic Legions community is incredible. Obviously the Cabal is super, super cool. It's great to have a group of like-minded fans and friends to be able to share this stuff with. But for those who customize, you realize very, very quickly that there's a group within the group. There's a community within the community. There are customizers. Your fellow customizers will help you out. When a customizer goes on and says, does anyone have an extra one of these parts? I don't want to buy a whole figure just to get this one piece, but it's exactly what I need for a custom recipe that I have going. You will routinely see fellow customizers jump in and say, I have one of those, I'll send it to you. Super, super helpful, super accommodating. And I talk to people all the time. I have fellow customizers, both very advanced who have been doing it for a long time and very, very new to the game that will routinely message me and send me photos of stuff and ask for my opinions and feedback. I'm happy to do it. I enjoy doing it. But I was having a conversation with Dennis, and I was doing that to him. I was saying, hey, I'm working on these mythic princesses. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I was showing him some of my ideas, and I showed him the Mulan build that I was working on, and he actually is the one that said Artemis would make a really cool head because she almost has kind of an Asian look to her already. And I haven't even gotten to the head yet. This was the first time that I put that articulated icon samurai armor on a Mythic Legions figure. So that's as far as I had gotten at that point. So he's the one that recommended that. But, Artemis normally came with this big giant headdress, and it's so obviously Artemis that because I wanted this to be a new character, I had to take that off. So that's what I did. I removed that crown and I replaced it. This one is actually the crown that came with the Malaki Cinderhorn figure. That's another one that's easily removable. So I removed that, pegged and glued that in here, painted it gold to match the gold around the rest of her crown, and it actually looks really, really seamless. Like it goes together really, really well. Eventually, this is a different one that I have, but eventually I ended up using one of these along with a Lord Adon head, and this peg is a little bigger than this hole, so I ended up, slicing this down a little bit, but I ended up using that at one point, and I repainted the Lord Adon head, and I actually turned that into a frost elf. I made a bunch of different frost elves to go with Talon Frostbow, and this character, the one that I did that used a Lord Adon head with that big, antler type crown, he was like my Lord of the Frost Elves, my Frost Elf King, if you have you. So once again, this is why I like doing this stuff, because you start pulling these pieces apart and you start to realize that you get all of this new fodder that you didn't even know was available to you. If you just look at the standard parts, the weapons and the fold armor and the pauldrons, you're very quickly going to have used them in so many ways that you start looking for new ways to use different parts. And I hope hopefully the stuff I'm showing you tonight is giving you some inspiration, opening up some new ideas, saying, yeah, I didn't even know I could use these parts, but I'm going to go pull Snag's hood off, or I'm going to pull this off my cow roast to get some of these pieces that I can use. And I've got a few more to show. Luis, nice to have you join. Thank you very much. Nice to see you here. So, someone said earlier they really like dwarves. So let's look at a few different things that I've done with dwarves. So this is a figure that I like a lot. This is my like classic dwarven kind of adventurer. I didn't know it at the time, but he reminds me a lot of the character from the video game Ghosts and Goblins, which I've never played, but I must have seen it and unconsciously decided to do this. But I did this because I had gotten like a Thord Ironjaw that didn't have the helmet. Very hard figure and hard head to come by, but for whatever reason, someone must have used the helmet for something. So that helmet was missing. So the helmet that was put on this instead is actually the one that came with the skeleton soldier from Advent of Decay. So the one that I mentioned earlier that has the female and the male torso, that helmet comes off. If you look at that skull and you look at that helmet, totally a separate piece. I removed that helmet and it was a tight fit on this dwarf head, but I got it on. It does go on. And it gives a very different look to the dwarf, partially because that helmet has the plume type piece here. And what I did was, you can see that visor he has, that is an easy thing to remove, but that's from Brother Mandibulus. So it just kind of pegs in at the sides. I pop that off, I put that on here, and it actually does, I can position it down. So if I want him to flip that visor down, I can do that as well to give me a different look for my dwarf. Pull it back up. And this gives me a very different looking dwarf for my display. And if you look at some of the dwarves, their helmets do come off. Again, that particular head, which we've only seen on Thord Ironjaw and on Halmar Golden Tooth, those are both high-ticket figures right now. You're probably not going to be picking one up just to pop their head off, but heck, who knows? Maybe you have an extra in your fodder bin somewhere and you want to do this. You can absolutely separate those helmets. And if you want to put a different style helmet on it, you totally can. How about a dwarf head that's a little easier to come across? Fair enough. So the dwarf head that we had on Bother Shadowhorn, it also came with the Cavern Dwarf, it came with the Barbarian Builder, it came with a lot of figures. The helmet I'm talking about is the top armored part with the long beard that comes down, and it's got two ports on the side that you can put different helmet attachments, different horns and stuff in. That's a head that you probably have in your fodder bin if you've done some customs. Especially, like I said, if you have Cavern Dwarves and you've used those for customs, Cavern Dwarves come with two heads anyway, one of which is that bearded head. You might have some of those lying around. That beard and that helmet part here, those are two separate pieces. And actually, now that I think about it, at the top of the show, I said that this orc helmet was the only really like 1.0 early type piece that I can imagine separating like that. I totally was neglecting to think about Thord that I just showed and this barbarian head that I'm talking about now. But one of the cool things that you can do with that head is if you separate that head from the beard, you end up with this upper metal helmet here. What I've done here, now this is not just separating parts and using them as is. I did have to do some cutting. If you remember, I did an episode a while back where I talked about cutting things with X-Acto knives. That's one of the things I did here. This is one of my Ghosts of Karamor figures. With what he does is he has that upper helmet from a barbarian type figure or a Cavern Dwarf, whatever you want to refer to it as. And then this lower jaw right here, that is from one of those skeleton soldiers. So the same skeleton soldier that I got the helmet to use for Thor here, that same kind of head. Once I was done with that helmet, I now had that little skeleton insert. Trying to figure what I want to do, I ended up slicing the jaw, the bottom jaw off, painting it like scaphoid to go with my Ghosts of Terramore, and I just glued that right underneath there. And that ends up giving you a very cool looking skeleton head. And once again, that top part is totally a barbarian type head. That barbarian builder type head or cavern dwarf head. Another example, I absolutely love this barbarian, which, you know, when you want to add that variety, because a lot of those barbarians, they have that same beard, I don't want to keep reusing that head over and over. So what I did with this one was I used that barbarian builder top head, remove the beard. And by the way, the beard, if you look at it, you'll see it just pegs underneath, okay? This is actually one that I find fairly easy to remove because it pegs right in. It's just a little bit of glue there. Heat that up and you can just kind of work that beard piece out and it just pops right out. You end up with the long beard with a peg that would normally go up inside the helmet. Super, super easy to do. In this particular case, I separated it and then I had a Lord of the Rings Gimli figure. The way he looked during the, I think they call it the ceremonial Gimli. It's the way he looked at the end of Return of the King when Aragorn was being crowned King of Gondor and Arwen and the procession of elves came up and they had the whole ceremony. The way that Gimli looked there, they did a figure of him and his beard is actually a bit bigger. Normally Gimli had a very, you know, kind of smaller beard, a lot of braids in it. This one, the figure at least, was much wider and it worked really, really well here with this head. And what I did was I carefully cut that beard apart and then glued it underneath that helmet to create this new looking barbarian. And I actually also glued a piece of the back of his hair on the back so it looked like it was, you know, the helmet, his hair was cascading out the back as well. But I really, really dig how that barbarian looks. And he's also, you know, got that cool blue body paint and everything, very Braveheart looking. This particular figure has got a bunch of older My Action Figure customs weapons, a couple axes. He's got a cool sword on his back. So, I mean, this has got a lot of cool parts to begin with. But just that, in you know, the spirit of what we're talking about tonight, that idea of separating parts, very, very easy to remove that beard, and then you can use that upper helmet. And by the way, the port that you plug into the neck, that is on the helmet part, not the beard. So when you remove the beard, the helmet part still just pegs right into the neck. All you're really doing, whether you're going to attach a skull jaw there, whether you're going to attach a new kind of beard. I mean, you could even put, if you had a figure, you could take like a Masters of the Universe figure, and if you cut the lower part of the jaw and glued that there, you could have a look that has that upper helmet but a lower human jaw that's not all bearded. All possibilities that you could do with kind of that one recipe. Okay, let's see what we got for questions. Got a few more things to show before we wrap it up tonight. Eric saying, what's up? Eric, nice to have you here as well. So I think the last thing that I have tonight to talk about is elf heads. So all of the elf and the vampires, they all come with a variety of these like helmeted heads. Take the elf legion builder, for instance. He comes with two heads that look like this, that are this style, that have like the open face. This is the light flesh colored. There's also a darker flesh colored. And then they also have helmets that are more like this. This is a vampire one, obviously, but the full helmeted face there. Those helmets absolutely come off. And you can do some pretty cool stuff once you remove them. Now, this is an example I was saying earlier where you want to be careful as you're removing the parts, because you don't just want to pull. Like that beard on the barbarian, if you just pull that out, you're not going to break it. You'll be fine. But like if you're removing Snag's helmet, the little edges around the ears, you could break that. And when you're removing these, some of the little pieces, like that little piece on the front of the helmet, if you pull too hard, you could rip that, and it's actually pegged into the nose. You could rip that and it could stay in the nose and you break the helmet, ruin the head you were trying to separate. So these are parts you do want to be careful. But there's a couple cool things that you can do here. So number one, let's look at this helmet here. So when you remove this, it is actually glued a little bit at the sides. And I'm going to get a little closer here. It's glued at the sides here. And then it's pegged in at the nose, and then it's glued in the back. So when I heat this and remove it, what I do is the first thing is I just take my finger and I separate these. And you can see there's kind of indentations there. So I separate these edges here, and then I separate the nose, and I just unpeg it. I just pull that out, and then I just start to work that head out until it comes out. Okay? Now, a couple cool things you can do. Number one, say that I want to repaint this head. This is what I did here for my Fury Elf Samurai. So when I did this Fury Elf Samurai, I did add these horns onto the head that came also. I mean, obviously, like all of my samurais, this uses parts from articulated icons. Those horns came from articulated icons, but forgetting about that for a moment, to get that red flesh tone on there, I did not try to paint that red elf face with that helmet on. That would have been terribly difficult. By removing that helmet and getting the head to look like that, I was able to paint it. And Nikki has done a bunch of tutorials where she shows how she paints heads. And I do something similar where when I want to paint a head like this, I will take like a little stick. I think she uses chopsticks with like a little paper towels on it. I'll put some blue tack on it. But basically I have a stick that's holding the head, and then I can use, I can paint around it and everything. And I have a big piece of foam that I'll stick the sticks in so the heads can dry. But the point is that with that head separated, it makes it so much easier for you to be able to paint that. But you could also just use this helmet as is. So just this helmet just being loose, you know what a cool thing you could do is, say that you have an extra elf legion builder and you have an extra unhooded head from an elf ranger. So the elf ranger came with the hooded head, which a lot of us use, but it also came with the head that just has the blonde hair down. It kind of looks like Legolas a little bit. That head, if you pop that unhooded head with the blonde hair on an elf legion builder body, you could put this helmet, like you could have him hold it under his arm. So it looks like he's cradling this helmet, and the helmet itself looks great. It looks like a cool little piece, like he just pulled that helmet off and is just displaying it separately. It's kind of similar to what a lot of people do when they put custom heads on like any of the knights or the Templars or something. Well, they'll take that helmeted Templar head and they'll cradle it under one arm. I've done this many times in my collection. It makes for a cool look because you have an unhelmeted character, but they're still holding their helmet. It's a way to maximize those parts. That's a way that you can do this here. Obviously you don't want the elf with his unhelmeted head holding an actual head. That's a very different kind of elf if he's walking around holding the severed head of one of his brethren. But if you pop that out and just have him hold the helmet, it's much less sadistic. You can do the same thing with the fully helmeted heads. The fully helmeted heads are funny, by the way, because when you pull them out, the heads that remain, they're creepy looking. The fronts of the faces, those particular heads, you don't really see the elf head through the visor part. It's just black, and what that is just the face underneath. That area is painted black. But same thing here. I've done this where I've removed, not a vampire, but I've removed like an elf legion builder, one that has the full helmet. I've removed that, and the elf legion builder, the fully helmeted head that it came with has the green flesh tone. They call those the Whisperlings. That's a kind of elf in Mythic Legions. Maria Golden Branch is one of them. But the fully helmeted head comes with the green whisperling skin tone. If you want to have other elf skin tones, either the light or the dark, with that fully helmeted head, this is an easy way to do it. Just pop that head out, paint the skin tone the color you want, and you pop it right back in. One thing I will say that I've noticed about this particular head is once you separate this front piece here, once you separate those pieces, they never seem to go back really, really tight. You probably will have to re-glue them, a little dab of glue, to get that helmet to hug the cheeks like it does naturally. Because once I pull it apart, it is kind of like fleshed out there. Let's see if I can. It's hard to get it to not be flared out like that. So you will want to re-glue it. But you could do the same thing here, is you could just have a character holding that full helmet. Some cool possibilities, you know. You could, if you wanted to, try to cram it on, you know, one of these. It kind of looks the same. If you try to cram one of the full helmets on one of the regular faces, they actually look almost the same. The helmets themselves are very, very close to each other. What you'll find is the fully helmeted ones, the cheeks, there's a little bit more on the cheeks there, a little bit more actual helmet. But if you try to put one of the full helmets on one of the non-helmeted, the non-full faces, it doesn't fit great. I'm sure you could do a little cutting and wedge it on, but it's going to look almost the same as just the normal look anyway, so probably not worth the effort. But again, something cool that you can do to have them hold those helmets, to give yourself a new look, or if you want to do something like what I did for the Fury Elf here, that's the way that you're going to want to separate it, to get that skin, you know, by itself, to make it so much easier to paint. So what we got for questions, comments? Drew said, I did not know the elf helms come off. Yeah, like I said, literally all of these different parts, they're not meant to pop off, but because they are separately sculpted pieces, they are all very, very malleable to pull off. And you can really do some cool stuff with it once you start separating them. It does open up a lot of possibilities. I have a lot of customs. The Fury Elf and the Zartan right there. Those are two of my favorites. I never could have gotten the skin, the color I wanted, as flawlessly as I was able to if I did not separate those parts. I know the hoods, a lot of people have separated the hoods. That is not probably news to anybody. But I do agree. I don't see a lot of people separating the elf helmets, but definitely something cool that you can do. So any other questions you got for me tonight? We got about 20 minutes or so left. Daniel saying, what's up? Wasn't sure I was going to make it. Well, nice to have you here, Daniel. Little drink of water there. So before I wrap up, I do have some other stuff to cover. Those are all the customs that I have to show tonight. Like every single week, once tonight's done, I will post better photos of all of these customs for you to see right here in the Cabal. Do have some announcements to make and some things to talk about. But we got some time here. Any other questions? Any other things you want me to answer or comment on? Shoot them over in the chat. Try to position her there. There we go. Everyone's being quiet tonight. Thank you all very much for joining live. We've got some people jumping on and jumping off, and that's cool. Everyone's got schedules. Like I said, the nice thing about shows like this is if you can join live, I think they are a lot of fun. But if you don't have the schedule, if you can't join live, certainly I've got a lot of people that I know view from other countries where it's a much different time than it is here on the East Coast of the U.S. That's totally cool. No problem there. That is exactly why I do repost on YouTube as well as the Cabal. David asking, ever thought of a recipe book? Not per se. I mean, my website has all of the recipes on it, so I don't know outside of that what I would do, like putting out a book of recipes. I will say that I have thought about doing a book project that I admittedly haven't done any work for. I have an idea. I have some things I want to do. I've got some connections. But it's not really a recipe book. It's a little something different in Mythic Legions and in customizing. That would be a book project. But yeah, I mean, interesting idea. I think the website, I mean, doing a printed book, as cool as it is to see things in print, there's a whole level of complexity that goes and a whole level of cost that goes into actually printing something commercially. The website is something that I can do, without, I mean, I'm a web designer, so I can do it myself. It doesn't cost me a whole lot to do that. That's really where my recipe book is right now, I would say, is mythiccustoms.com. Jovany saying, do you have any tips for painting war paint? I mean, war paint is actually a kind of a fun thing to paint because by definition, it's at least it doesn't have to be smudged on. But when I imagine war paint, I imagine it being largely just kind of like smudged on. I haven't done a ton of it. I did this one here, obviously, some of the war paint on this one. I did another one of these for somebody else, which it's nice because what I do is I just take a brush, I dip it in the paint that I want, and I just try to do one pass when I do war paint. Because war paint, if you were putting it on, if you were, say you're an orc and you're slathering war paint, you're not going to be sitting there and painting it carefully. You're going to be taking that paint and slapping it on, slapping it on. That's how I imagine a lot of war paint. Yes, you could have stuff that's a lot nicer looking. It's more maybe ceremonial type paint that you would want to be a lot more meticulous in paint there. That's going to require obviously a very steady hand. But the suggestion that I would make on war paint is get a small flat top brush. So something that's going to, not be a long, thin brush, but is going to be kind of, a little bit kind of pudgy, short and flat. Use that, dip it, and use that to actually look like someone's smudging it on. I would also, to test first before you get it on one of these, to me, war paint is the perfect type of thing to get a cheap figure. Or if you've got, like, say you're using some Lord of the Rings parts for fodder and you've ripped apart, you've taken their feet off and you've ripped apart their cape and their loin and you've just got that random figure, use that random figure that's garbage now. Use that to test out some different war paint techniques to see what works for you. But that's how I like to paint it. When I've done like different orcs and I get a whole bunch of monks that all have kind of, and even theirs are meant to look a little more ceremonial. But the nice thing is, like I said, it doesn't have to be super clean. It can be a little bit more smudgy. That's how I do it. Daniel saying, have I ever thought about doing a Warhammer 40K inspired custom? No, because I don't know what it is. I've never played Warhammer. Warhammer is the tabletop game, correct? I've never played it, so it's not something that I have a connection to. Occasionally I'll do things that I don't have a strong connection to, like a video game or something. It's rare. But usually when I do something, it has to be something that I'm familiar with, that I want for my own collection. So Warhammer not being something, again, that's why I do so many that are inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, because that's very nostalgic for me. Warhammer's not something I've ever played or know anything about. So because of that, it's never really been something I want to do. I know there's another customizer that does like crazy detailed customs. And I think that where he's getting them from is Warhammer. Because I don't recognize any of the stuff he does. It looks cool, but I don't recognize the source material he's using. And I think he always talks about it being like, I think he puts Warhammer plus Mythic Legions, which would make sense that I wouldn't recognize where they're from. Travis Bowles. Nice to have you here, Trav. Trav and I had a nice long conversation earlier today. Good times. So any other questions, feel free to shoot them, but I'll start wrapping up as I answer these. Daniel saying, yeah, it's tabletop game. Thought the design for Space Marines would be cool into Mythic. Yeah, maybe I'll take a look. Like I said, I have so many other ideas, so many things that I'm working on. The other day, actually, part of with this quarantine is obviously I'm not spending actually more time in the studio because I've been so busy with other stuff. My work has just been really, really busy. But I did count the amount of custom projects that I have in one state of completion or another in the back room, and it was 45. Literally, I have 45 additional customs that are in some state of completion that I haven't shown on my Instagram yet. So what I'm trying to point out is I got plenty of stuff in the hopper right now. So I'm not super enthused to do things that I don't have a connection to, but it sounds cool. I'll take a look. You recommended it. I'll take a look at Warhammer, see what it is. Drew saying we are a whole bunch of nerds. Yes, this is a great time to be a nerd all around. So a couple things before I end the show. I always talk about for sale Saturday. I will still continue selling stuff on Saturdays. People still seem to want to be buying them, so I'll still keep offering them. Last week's didn't sell, but it's okay. It's actually back here in the case. I'm fine with keeping them. I always say that to people. Occasionally, someone will say, how firm are you on the price? And I'm always very firm. The prices I put up there are almost always what I need to get for them, because if I don't get them, they go right back in the collection. So I do have last week's was kind of my version of Keldor from Motu. It was like a dark elf with a skull mask. I got that in the case with my shadow elves. He's happy there. But this week is one that I think people will be into. I know people like vampires, so this week I have a custom vampire that I'm going to be putting up. It uses a 1.0 style body, which I know a lot of people really like the bulkier 1.0 figures. But he comes with some cool stuff, including a really cool sword and a throne, a cool vampire throne. So if you're looking for a vampire to kind of, be maybe a centerpiece for yourself, a throne type vampire, might be something that you'll be interested in. So that'll be available Saturday morning at 10 o'clock Eastern time, like all of my pieces are. Outside of that, let's see what else. I don't know what. Okay. Anyway, so outside of that, I will give you a little bit of teaser for next week's show. So next week's show is one that I am super, super excited to bring to you. If you've been watching Mythic Conversations, you've heard me talk for a while now about a project that I had been working on with a fellow Mythic Legions fan. I am finally ready to share that with everybody, and I could not be more excited. It has been killing me to not be able to share this stuff with all of you. It is literally a project that I've been working on since last year. Since 2019, the end of 2019, this project started. Very, very cool. Very excited to bring it to you. You've seen all of my customs. You see the way that I use other toy lines and I use other 3D printed parts. Well, I've wanted to do something totally unique that you've never seen anywhere else that uses parts that I helped design. And that is what I'm going to be showing you next week. All next week, I'm going to be showing some different pictures of these customs, some different pictures of these parts, leading up to Wednesday night, where I'm going to talk at length about them. So I tell you that because tonight was very tips focused. I showed you a bunch of different things that you can hopefully use in your customs. I do that a lot of weeks where I show different techniques or different tips that hopefully will inspire. Next week's show is literally going to be me gushing a project that I'm super excited about. Not going to be a lot of tips and tricks that you can follow, but if you want to hear a fellow Mythic Legions fan geeking out about something they're super excited about and is super near and dear to them, then you'll probably dig next week. So I hope you will join me. I hope you will enjoy what I have to bring to you. And that's it. Super excited for next week. With that, I think we're going to wrap this up. Like every week, thank you very much for joining me on Mythic Conversations. Everyone stay safe. Hopefully, pretty soon this is going to start being in our rearview mirror, and we're going to start being able to talk again about, not only things like cons and, new releases, but just being able to get back to a little bit of life like normal and, get a little bit, lots of people are genuinely afraid, get a little bit of, a sense of our comfort back, our sense of safety back. But until then, and actually beyond then, I will be here every Wednesday night for Mythic Conversations. Thank you all very much. As Drew likes to say, next week, same Mythic time, same Mythic channel. Very excited to show you what I have, and I will see you then. Thank you. Good night.